Hello, and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Moser's 8th grade U.S. history class. This is a topic looking at the Cold War, looking at some of the conflicts that took place during the Cold War, some of the actual wars that were fought during this aspect of time. The two textbook sections that will go with this particular reading comes to us from War in Korea and a New Red Scare, pages 852 to 857, and Kennedy and Foreign Policy, pages 894 to 897. Our guiding questions today are: what was a proxy war? What was meant by the domino effect? Why did the United States get involved in the Korean War? Why did the United States get involved in the Vietnam War? What was the legacies of the Korean and Vietnam War? So those become our topics and questions for this lecture. So what's a proxy war? Well, a proxy war is a war in which the superpowers kind of backed different sides that acted as substitutes or proxies for the superpowers themselves. In the actual Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union never directly attack each other, but they do act through proxies, third parties that will kind of get at each other militarily and will involve some tensions and conflicts. And in the case of the United States, there will be two major conflicts that we'll be involved with, that the Soviet Unions will use proxies to kind of get to us during the Cold War. The domino effect was a theory that was kind of around the time period of the Cold War that was feeling that if one nation fell to communism, the whole neighborhood would soon fall to communism as well. Remember, we talked about that policy of containment, and the domino theory is definitely a piece or an expansion of this containment philosophy. So if one nation drops to communism, very soon it will create a chain reaction that could create more communist nations and create instability among democratic and capitalist nations. During the Cold War, the United States will be involved in two major wars, both in Asia, as a policy of this containment and of the domino theory to prevent the spread of communism into Asia. The Korean War will be fought between 1950 and 1953, and the Vietnam War will start around 1959, escalate throughout the 1960s, and will not end really until the 1975s. As you can see here from the graphic here, China in the 1950s will fall to communism, will have a revolution which will change its government over to communism, and Korea, Vietnam, and Laos are looking like they are going to also fall to communism, and the worry is that this will spread throughout Asia. So during the Cold War era, this will be the kind of the crux of our policy in the foreign policy arena, is that we don't want the spread of communism to take place. So the first of these conflicts basically ends in Korea in the 1950s. And at the end of World War II, kind of like what happened in Germany, Korea is also split between the Allies. In the north, the communists, the Soviet Union, sort of takes that region of the north and establishes a communist pro-Soviet government. And the Americans in the south create kind of more a southern democratic capitalist government. Now, the original plan, like in Germany, was to eventually unify the two countries under one. But in 1950, the North Korean army invades the south to try and unify the Korea by force, and actually is very successful, actually overruns most of the Korean defense forces and drives them all the way down to the very, very tip of the peninsula, down here in the very, very south. President Truman orders the U.S. military to support South Korea and goes to the United Nations for international support. The Soviet Union, which is one of the voting members on the UN Security Council, is protesting other actions that were taking place and doesn't block the UN vote, and the UN does agree to provide international support to help stop the communists taking over of the South, and thus begins the Korean War. Fearing a world war, Truman will keep kind of pushing for a peace settlement, and it really won't be until his predecessor, President Eisenhower, steps in where you'll kind of see a final settlement of the conflict between the North and South, which pretty much stopped exactly where they started, along the 38th parallel, that dividing line between North and South. So really no boundaries were really fundamentally changed between the North and the South, and as a result, 54,000 Americans died in the war, and it costs about $20 billion. Oftentimes, Korea is viewed as kind of our forgotten war because it's between two major conflicts. This is between World War II, and it's also between Vietnam, which tend to get a lot more more focus placed upon it. But it was still a very important and pivotal role, and still very important for us today. America still maintains a very large military presence along the border between North and South Korea. The treaty that ended the war was really an armistice, so technically the nations are still at war with each other. They've just held a long signed armistice treaty, a ceasefire, not to shoot at each other. North Korea is believed to have nuclear weapons and is developing missile technology to deliver those weapons as well, and has made some statements to the United States as well as to some other Asian nations that are allies like South Korea and Japan that you could definitely see as threatening. So even though this battle ended in the 1950s, the Korean War ended in the 1950s, it's still very much a very important aspect of our international policies and still plays a very pivotal role in our theater in Asia still to this very day. The Vietnam War will be the second major conflict that will take place in the Cold War era. And really, as the Korean War is starting to slow down, the Vietnam War is beginning to kind of pick up here as well. Again, the Vietnam War, same policy of the Korean War, is to contain communism, the domino theory. Don't let a nation fall to communism. And so the United States provides all types of support to our allies in South Vietnam. Vietnam is much like Korea. It's also divided, communist to the north, democratic to the south. It's kind of a civil war that takes place really throughout the 50s and 60s. And the United States gets into it as a kind of an ally to the democratic forces and tries to prevent a communist overthrow. The Soviet Union backs the Vietnamese in the north, the communists, and it really begins to escalate very, very quickly. Despite our military overwhelming power with our technology, the Viet Cong, the guerrilla fighters, will fight a guerrilla war tactic with surprise attacks, blending in with civilians, and will fight more of a defensive battle and will end up defeating the American forces in Vietnam. You can see here some of the famed Viet Cong tunnels that they dug to basically hide themselves from these American patrols or bombing raids that were oftentimes used during the conflict within Vietnam. So what's the legacies of Vietnam? Well, like the war in Korea, it's a long, costly war. In Vietnam, 58,000 Americans will be killed as a result. The famous Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C. lists all the names of all those who died in Vietnam. And as the war kind of drags on into the 1960s, more and more Americans become kind of disillusioned and upset by our growing influence and involvement in world affairs, and become more and more opposed to the war in Vietnam and other conflicts around the world. It's estimated that about 1.2 million Vietnamese are killed as well. The Vietnam War also left a legacy of a very divided nation in the 1960s. Some soldiers were treated very poorly when they came back home. Many Americans protested the war. They were drafted into combat military service, and some men refused to serve in the Vietnam War. They burnt their draft cards. Some fled even away to Canada. Most Americans became very, very opposed to the war effort, feeling that it was not America's business to sort of police the world and get involved in a nation's affairs thousands of miles away. So anti-war protests, anti-Vietnam War protests really escalate throughout the 1960s as well. Another legacy of the Vietnam War was the lowering of the voting age. The voting age used to be 21 in most states, but out of concerns that so many 18-year-old men were going over and fighting in Vietnam who didn't have any direct say in elections, push for the passage of the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, which is now why 18-year-olds are now allowed to vote. Thank you for listening as we looked at some of the proxy wars that take place during the Cold War. Korea and Vietnam, both to stop the spread of communism, this fear of the domino theory. If one country falls to communism, there goes the neighborhood. The whole region will become a communist safe haven. And America's policy of the Cold War is to not let communism spread. And so we get involved in these two major wars that still leave a very lasting impact even today. Thank you for listening. And as always, if you have questions, please make sure you come talk to your teacher.